Mr. Yeoh has spent many years as senior economist in GIC, and then he retired last year. What he does after retirement is very interesting. I just went into his Facebook and I found out a lot of things. And one of the things he wrote here, which actually is very good, because I myself am also a retiree. He said he gave some tips about gainful unemployment in Singapore. There are several rules. The last rule, he says, remain critical, but try not to let the government irritate you, no matter how aggravating they are. I think that's very good for all of us here. So, well, without much ado, I hand the mic over to Lam Keong.
I know most of you, and I'll just keep it informal, and I just want to sort of like stop me anytime and just ask questions. Economists, always tend to go on and talk in the clouds, and you can't understand what the hell they're saying, so you just got to pull me down and say, hey, what do you mean? So what I'm going to try and have a chat about this evening is, I was given the title, The New Normal in Economics with reference to Singapore. I guess new normal means a lot of things to different people, but to me, I think the interesting thing about the new normal is that there probably, you can think about two kinds of new normal. First, of course, we all know there's a new normal in politics. New normal in politics is, I would say, the almost inevitable kind of move towards more democratic politics everywhere, and in Singapore, no exception. So that trend is definitely going on. So that's the new normal that people are having to adjust to. The other one is in economics, so I want to explore that a bit more and how that actually influences and interacts with the new normal in politics. So I want to talk a bit more, since I'm from economics, about the new normal in economics, and here I want to examine there is a new normal in economics too, just like in politics the last 10, 15 years. And just like in politics, the next 5, 10 years is going to be quite, I think, quite critical and quite, see a lot of change coming from the new normal in economics, just as it comes from the new normal in politics. And the conjunction of the two are going to be very interesting. The three aspects to the new normal in economics. The first is the new normal environment from the global and regional economic environment, from globalization broadly, and I'll discuss that. And that tends to generate, I'll argue, we all know, I guess, but income inequality of a very difficult kind. I'll describe the nature of it. Secondly, it also tends to result in wages being stagnant for a wide range of people, especially ordinary people, in the median of the population. And there will be difficulties coming from this source. And then secondly, besides the global environment, there's the domestic policy environment. And here our growth model that we've been pursuing for the last 20 years has actually made this income inequality and wage stagnation worse. In fact, it has even brought down wages to the bottom, so it needs to change. The government is aware of this. But the change itself is going to be quite difficult. It's going to be a big adjustment both for workers, ordinary people, employees, as well as for companies, for the Singapore industry. So I'm going to talk about that. And there'll be a lot of pressures as people are transferred from jobs, relocated and pushed here and there, as industries change, some die, some take over, and a lot of stress in society. And that too will put pressure on the population. And finally, there is the other aspect of the new normal, which will come soon, and we've heard about this in the press, is of course the aging population, the demographics. And Singapore is going to age a lot. And as we age, the pressures to take care of us, as we age, but also other old folks, in terms of their medical needs, in terms of their retirement needs, in terms of their social needs, is going to become more and more acute. And so all these three things, these three forces, from demographics and aging, from from adjustment of economic policy, very wrenching adjustment, from globalization, they're all going to come together, and it's going to put a lot of demands by the population on the government for some answers. And in this new environment, when government is much more open and people cannot be kept quiet anymore, and we're politically organized. What is the intersection of the new normal in economics and the new normal in politics? This will actually define, I think, very important way the nature of Singapore society, the nature of Singapore politics over the next 10 years plus in quite a different way than we are seeing now, perhaps much more far-reaching changes. And at the heart of this will be how the government interacts via social policy with citizens, right? That's really where the rubber meets the road, if you like. And out of that could come several different futures. I want to discuss some of them. It could evolve in certain ways that are better for society, in other ways perhaps not so good. So what are the main ways that it would happen? I just want to kind of go through it kind of very quickly. So just shoot over here. And so we know that globally, regionally, in the near term, the next 1-2 years, there's a lot of problems in the major economies, US, Europe, China, etc., etc. I don't have to go through that. And the global economy is more vulnerable than before because all the kind of like government resources have been exhausted in the last great financial crisis. So if there's another bad financial crisis, it's going to be very hard for governments to find the resources to get out of it. And there's not much scope for monetary easing either because interest rates everywhere are at zero already. So there's not much more they can do there. So there's limited safety net for the global economy. Singapore too is seeing its own form of crisis near term. Inflation, 4.7 supposed to be 4.5. Actually, Singapore is, ironic. Singapore now is the highest inflation rate in ASEAN, right? Higher than Malaysia, higher than Thailand, higher than Indonesia even. And who would have thought this 15 years on from the Asian crisis, right? That we would have the highest inflation rates. And a difficult inflation problem as we slow down cheap labor inflow and costs are rising. So they will be forced to control this inflation, and there'll be a lot of upward pressure on the Singapore dollar. I expect it to reach parity over the next few years, both against the dollar and the euro. And as this adjustment takes place, you may well see big strains on our property market. And the property market is in the bubble, as you know, and it's very vulnerable in this environment, right? So there's a big risk of recession and the Sing dollar overshoot. This is just near term, but I want to focus a bit more on the medium term aspects. And here I want to come closer to home and look at the underlying, maybe trends and strains on society over maybe a longer term horizon, 5 years, 10 years, 2 elections, right, 2016 through 2021. What kind of social demands and forces are going to be unleashed? The main point I'd like to make first, just to summarize, is that the social compact that we have with the government, social compact being the relationship between the citizens and the governors and people who govern us, will come under strain, as well as the relationship between citizens themselves, between each other, right? It's the social compact. Will come under strain from globalization, from the contradictions in the growth model, particularly this very labor-intensive growth, and trying to back out of that, reverse that, and doing this with an insufficient provision of social policy, as has been the stance and philosophy of governments here. That's going to be very difficult. And so it therefore will be a race between whether or not we can actually reform this growth model, reform this social policy model, or face, if we don't do it enough, a breakdown of policy trust. Singapore is characterized by very strong trust, has been characterized by very strong trust in policy in the government. And as a result, it's a very valuable asset we've built up because a lot of us trust the government to do big, difficult things in the long run, even if it means difficulty for us in the short run. We trust the government will be able to do it, trust the government has our interests, best interests at heart, and can do the right thing. But if this trust breaks down, like all trust, it's going to be very difficult for us to do this in the new normal, in the more democratic world, and it will lead to all kinds of problems. It may lead to kind of policy paralysis. I'll talk about that later. But at any rate, we know that public scrutiny of policy has grown exponentially, right? And there's nothing that the government can do right now without extreme scrutiny. And very often, if there's lack of trust, it will be unfair scrutiny, right? There's nothing they can do right? So policy could become populist or unstable, it could become ad hoc. Different branches of government could respond to different public pressure without reference to other branches of government, and it's very, ad hoc. And at worst case, it could be unstable. You could get political instability, one form or another, right? And so there's something larger at risk, and this is the medium to long term, as opposed to 3 year, 5 to 10 year outlook that we find ourselves in now. Explore that a bit more. But first, I think I just want to examine what is the long-term growth model that Singapore has been used to and we are all very familiar with. First of all, in the economic side, the production sphere, we are very reliant on large global MNCs for industrial development, and the local industry, unlike Taiwan, Korea, or Japan, is very thin and almost non-existent outside the GLC sector. Manufacturing is a key strategic sector and a very large share of our economy compared to other economies of the same per capita GDP. Compared certainly to Hong Kong, which hardly has any manufacturing at all, we still have 25% of our industry in manufacturing. And a very big industrial policy effort by the GDP to maintain that. We've had very high immigration-intensive growth over the last 20 years. We've grown the population by 2 million, right? 1 million a year. And that's created its own problems. Our current growth model and our social policy model is very reliant on individual and family support. And that's fine when you have, as we did even recently, 7.5 people, working adults, supporting one retired person in 2010. But by 2050, there's only going to be 1.5 working adults supporting a retired person. So there'll be a very big crunch in being able to maintain individual and family reliance, particularly. In an environment of market welfare, we've become very market driven. We've outsourced a lot of social policy to market outcomes, including housing, a lot of health, increasingly so education. I'll describe how. And in this environment, with loose and weak regional governments, you can look at ASEAN right now and see it's a mess. What are the prospects for change that we face? Okay, so I want to talk about the challenges and opportunities. First of all, I just want to list the challenges. The challenges are that technology is going to worsen all these trends that I talked about, and worsen the tendency towards wage stagnation. It's going to worsen the tendency towards income inequality, and this will be part of a general trend in unskilled wage stagnation and skilled wage stagnation in developed economies. I'll elaborate on that in a bit. Domestically, however, we've all come to realize that there's a big need for wage restructuring. Recently, Prof. Lim Chong Yao was up on his feet again and repeating the same message again at the recent Economic Policy Forum. And his message is very simple. It's that the blue-collar workers in Singapore have had their wages depressed to such an extent that they are facing actually what we call working poverty. And compared to most other countries, in fact, we have one of the highest per capita incomes in the world. We've never seen countries with such a high per capita income with such low wages for the working class before, right, in economic history. And so there's a big political need for wage restructuring. And how is that going to come about? There's aging population, there's the erosion of the compact. But before I go on into all this bad news, I want to say also that there are also opportunities, right? Singapore is located at the heart of an increasingly Asian-centric global economy. For example, India and China together in another 20, 30 years are going to be 9 times the size of Japan. And there's India to the left, China to our right, there's Indochina to our north, there's Indonesia to our south, and they're all growing at 5 to 10%. And so we're very, very dynamic, most dynamic, biggest economic region in the world. So there'll be tremendous opportunity there if we can play our economic policy cards right. Second, we have huge fiscal resources, both from reserves and from the budget, and we can utilize it intelligently. We can both insulate our population as well as take advantage of these opportunities. We have an excellent infrastructure and infocom structure, very well educated, at least for the new generations, bilingual workforce. All said and done, we have an excellent government, and I think this is, at the end of the day, I'm talking about civil service. I'm not talking about the whole thing. I'm talking about, in terms of bureaucratic capability, we have one of the best, probably one of the best civil services in the world. And this is going to be a very, very important, if you like, institutional resilience that we're going to have, because it could well be stress tested to its limit, and this will be something that prevents Singapore from going down beyond a certain point. And will form a very strong base for us to come back from whatever position we find ourselves in. And we have still a good long-term policy-making capability, although that is under threat. So we know about the Infocom's revolution. Computers are replacing people in a whole range of jobs because they can just, Infocom's intelligence is changing exponentially. It enables us to outsource a lot of the services, from anything from radiological services, accountancy services, backroom services, financial services, and then we can export jobs through the computer, through a wire. And so people don't even have to come here. You can export them to India, or you can export them to Latin America or wherever, Philippines, even if you don't have any immigrants. And so there's what you call the disappearing middle, depressed wages in the middle class in all developed countries. Manufacturing too is changing. These days there's a new technology that you can actually manufacture things in 3D, for materials in 3D, and that therefore, MNCs may not need to locate in intermediate locations anymore. They can locate just either in be next to technology or next to the big markets, and to cut out a lot of this so-called supply chain over time, of which we are a part, of which our industrial development is premised on, and so that's very vulnerable. But I want to get back to the basic challenge that we have, and that Bin Chong Yang has raised, and that we all feel as we meet people. When we go down to HDBs, or we go down to the coffee shops and hawker centers, this big addition in the unskilled labor force in the last 20 years has really depressed blue-collar wages and productivity. For example, wages of construction workers in Singapore are less than about $1,000. Wages of construction workers in Hong Kong are $2,500. Wages of plumbers in Singapore are $1,500, $1,300. In Hong Kong, they're $2,002. Nurses, etc. So the whole range of blue-collar operations are much lower in Singapore because of this huge influx of labor. So we've effectively damaged very badly the earning power of our working class over an extended period of time. It takes us a long time to get out of this. To me, this is one of the biggest policy errors that we've done in our economic policy history. Not intentionally, but it has happened. And as a result, there's very little incentive for firms to use higher value-added technology, higher skills, when they have access to so much cheap labor, right? So Singapore has essentially become, in certain sectors, a cheap labor location and a high rental location where people invest in real estate and labor-intensive operations, right? And a lot of the rest of the economy has not developed as well. But there's a flip side to this. The flip side to this is that if you consider, for example, productivity in Singapore construction and Hong Kong construction, there's a big potential to catch up, right? Or Singapore construction and Australian construction, there's a big potential to catch up. Instead of using 40, 50 people on a site to build a house, using string to take measurements, you can use just 2 people, very skilled operations, and you can have big potential to raise productivity and wages. not just in specific industries, but in the economy as a whole, right? So there is big productivity catch-up potential, even though we are at such high per capita GDP levels. No other country has that, but this is something to be proud of, just because we depressed it. But that potential is there. Now I want to talk a bit about the scale of the problem in adjusting these wages and adjusting the labor force growth to a reasonable rate. I just want to dwell on this chart for a bit. This chart shows on the vertical axis the projected final population of Singapore. This is 20 million, this is 18 million, 16 and so forth. And this is by 2050. And these different colored lines show how the population grow under different assumptions of labor force growth. So this is 3.5% labor force growth. This is 3%, 2%, 1.5%, 0.5% labor force growth. Okay. Now historically, you should know that the last 20 years we've grown at 3.5% labor force growth. That is what has given us this very labor-intensive, excessive growth rate, right? Now, if we keep this up, and this is just a straightforward arithmetic computation, this is one of the surest things that economists can project is demographics. Not much else, unfortunately. But we can say with certainty that if we grow at 3.5% labor force growth, we will end up in 2050 with nearly 18 million people in Singapore. So if we keep up what we've done in the last 20 years, we're going to have with 18 million. I can't even imagine it, but we are. 3% will give us 15 million, by the way, if we will conclude a little bit. Now, if we bring it down to 2%, 1.5% to 2%, and this is the higher end of the range that the Economic Strategies Committee, which was chaired by Minister Tharman, proposed. He said that we should be growing something at 1 to 2%, or 0 to 2%, that was the kind of range. But this also shows that if we grow at 2%, or even 1.5%, we will end up with a population of 10 to 11 million in 2050, right? And right now, even though industry is already screaming, you can see it in papers, SME saying this, that, the other, we are still growing at about slightly over 2%. So we are right now on track for 11 million, right? With industry kicking and screaming. Right? So can you imagine we have to dial this down to 0.5% growth before we can peak at the end of the day at 6.5 million, which is already a challenge, right? So this is the kind of very Herculean task that we have to do. We have to come down from here to here. And every, we can say, oh yeah, we take some time, we take time to adjust, blah, blah, blah. But then the longer that we spend here, the more time we have to spend here to get this average, right? So this just gives you an idea of the scale of the adjustment, both to labor and to industry, of the economic restructuring effort that we face. And the consequence is not just growth rates, the consequence is this kind of society. Think a bit about what 10 million population would be in Singapore. Keng Soon is quite famous for saying that actually you put it in certain arrangements, you can squeeze people into 10, 11 million. That's probably physically true, and we can ask you about that afterwards. But as an economist, it's not just a matter of physically squeezing people into areas comfortably. Think of the prices that would pertain, right? If you think real estate prices are high now, imagine what they will be at 10 to 11 million population. If you think that landed prices vis-a-vis HDB prices, the spread is high now, think of what they will be in 10 to 11 million population when most of this population will be in HDB, right? And the densities there are going to be like Mumbai. Right? So imagine what the spreads will be. Imagine how unequal wealth distribution will be, or income distribution will be in that kind of society. Imagine that when you're on the streets, most of the people that you'll see in the MRT and emergency rooms will be foreigners, right? In this society. So this society is going to be more like Dubai today, right? Than the Switzerland that we once fondly dreamed of becoming, right? So essentially it's a choice not just of
physical numbers and growth, but it's a choice of the kind of society you want. Right? And I think that this is something that is not, I'm quite disappointed with the population department for not highlighting this choice of Singaporeans, because I think if most Singaporeans knew this, there will be very strong pressure on government to bring down the labour force growth rate much more significantly. Singapore's environment has been much higher, much more volatile. We've had 4 recessions, 2 major financial crises in 13 years. As we are adjusting, we've had higher structural unemployment. You know, the share of professional managers among the unemployed are roughly half now, from 25%. There's a problem of chronic working poor because of the people wages being depressed. We've also got a big legacy problem. There are about 400,000 workers roughly my age who have not passed primary 6. During my time, PSLE, about half the class didn't go on to secondary school. So a lot of these people now in the workforce, and should they lose their job, some of them are having fairly senior job sales positions, but the moment they lose their job, they're not educated, they are 40, 50 years old. Next step down is taxi driver, right? I don't think it's $7,000 a month, right? so there are problems, they will face problems for retirement income, medical coverage. And so this is kind of like summarizing what we're seeing right now from all those factors I was mentioning earlier, challenges that we're going to face. Now talk a bit about the poor. What does it mean to be poor in Singapore? I think let's be a bit more specific about it. I've estimated from the latest survey of households, it's not easy to get hold of this data because the government doesn't really want to calculate it explicitly, so you have to calculate it implicitly from a number of tables. When asked in Parliament about these numbers, they're not sure, they don't sound very convincing that they know themselves what the answer is after all this hiding around. But sort of estimated that there are roughly 100,000 poor households, roughly 3.8 people per household, 350, 380,000 citizens living in poverty, of which I think 2/3 are what you call working poor. Working poor means that you have one member at least fully employed, right, in that household. So these are people who are working full-time. These are not people who are unemployed like in other countries, who are typically unemployed. And yet do not earn enough. They earn only about 357 per capita. So most social workers will tell you under $400 that this family is at risk of not having enough to meet ends meet, right? So I would say about 2/3 of these people are working poor. Now these are the people who find it difficult to give their kids enough pocket money. So the kids, or they may have to eat 2 meals a day so their kids can eat 3 meals a day. Or they always face, utility shut-offs because they can't pay the bills. And you hear stories about the kids, bringing water home from school so they can, have enough water at home and stuff like that. So, those of you who do grassroots work and you walk into these flats, you know what they look like, right? Mattresses on the floor, very sparse furniture. You may have a flat screen TV, but then, there is obviously not enough for decent standard of living. And then, of course, the unemployed poor, about 20,000, the retired poor, about 20,000, and growing. So about bottom 8% of working age households face this kind of poverty. And it's strange, given that we are second highest per capita GDP, or the highest in the world. So this chart just shows you how median wages, that is to say 5th decile wages, have been essentially flat for a long time at the individual level. Depending on the starting period, the government says it's been increasing at a rate of 1% real terms a year for the last 10 years, but result, I do not know, but that is, they take full-time employed jobs, they don't adjust for hours, they don't adjust for part-time jobs. Hard to say, but anyway, even if it's 1%, 1% isn't a hell of a lot a year, and given the way costs are rising, or key costs are rising, outside the CPI, and you can see that it's roughly flat and it's been falling at the bottom. So in the light of all these things, would argue that we actually need to really review our social security system, right? In light of the pressures from globalization, in light of the pressures from, from policy adjustment, which is trying to shift people out of labor-intensive to capital-intensive, but they will have to look for jobs in between. Industry will have to close down in between. And also from demographics. We need to revamp social security system. Just for governance credibility, right? We talked about governance credibility earlier, and it's linked to policy trust, right? So for example, in the US right now, or in many parts of Europe, there is a crisis of trust in policy, and that is because governments have overpromised and now have to break those promises, right, of pensions, of social security support systems. But in Singapore, the reverse can be true, right? You can also lose trust from not doing enough of these things when you're supposed to do, because this is the business of government, right? And I would like to point out in Singapore, the tolerance for government performance is unusually high. Unusually high for several reasons. One, Singaporeans, great bunch of complainers, right? But there's more to it than that. The reason we are such a great bunch of complainers when it comes to government performance is due to several reasons. One is, I think we have implicitly traded political and social freedoms for government performance, haven't we? So and not just ministerial pay. So if I'm paying you so much, and I've given you so much of my political freedoms, if you don't perform, you're going to be held to a very, very unusually high standard globally, right? So what is good enough globally is not good enough for Singaporeans because they have traded these things, they have paid such a high price, they feel, probably rightly, for this performance. And so for the sake of let's say governance credibility, but also for the sake of social justice, a new social security system is needed. I'll talk a bit about social justice, economic aspects of what I mean by social justice in a while. Secondly, also just as an economic policy analyst for competitiveness, there are lots of countries like Denmark, for example, that has one of the most flexible labor markets in Europe because they have strong social safety nets, right? Because Denmark has a very strong social safety net, they can close down shipyards, they can reallocate labor, they can do a lot of very daring economic restructuring because they know that people are going to be taken care of in between industries, right? They lose jobs, they're supported in between, retrained, etc. So you can be actually more aggressive in restructuring the economy. And of course, there's social well-being. And I just want to talk about social justice before I leave this slide. What do we mean by social justice? What do Singaporeans really mean by social justice? And hear this term very a lot. I think to me, what they really are talking about is not equality of outcomes. I don't think any Singaporean expects or wants equality of outcome. What they want is a certain degree of equality of opportunity, right? So they want to feel that whatever social outcomes are, that their kids will have similar chances as a rich man's kid. That is what they mean, I think, by social justice. And I will go on to examine some of our social policy in this slide. So, summarizing, I think for social safety net, social security, we do need to recognize that given this restructuring that we're going through, and given globalization, we do need to have certain key reforms in place. Firstly, if you want to actually do away with poverty, what the problem of the working poor, you can actually do away with it probably within a month, right? And the way that you can do that is just to raise your work-fed income supplement payouts, currently about on average $120 a month, most of it in CPF. You can just raise it to $350 a month, right, of which 120 will be CPF and the rest is cash, and you've virtually taken care of the problem of working, at least the worst of working poverty, right? Now this is going to cost you the princely sum of $900 million to $1 billion a year, which is about 0.3% of our GDP. So it's easily affordable. It can be done next month when you get the next paycheck, but we're still studying it. Okay. So we also need, of course, a proper unemployment protection insurance system because we are going to, precisely because we're going to reallocate labor so drastically away from untenable labor-intensive sectors to new sectors, this needs to take place. And a lot of these people, don't forget, are old people that find it very difficult to adjust, right? Would be the older people with less education, the 300,000-400,000 legacy people I'm talking about. And to help these people, you need to look after their basic unemployment retirement needs. We should think seriously about an inflation index retirement grant that is means tested. They have one in Hong Kong. So it'll give you a few $100s a month if you're poor enough in Hong Kong. And calculated cost of these two is about 0.5% of GDP, right? You do also need to actually broaden your CPF a bit, and the way you can do it is just simply to give a higher CPF interest rate, giving back people more of what you actually earn in GIC or Temasek. And you need to move towards a more universal medical coverage, right? More universal medical care. Because this is going to be one big cost for older people. Overall, we need to really just reconsider the balance between savings, which we are completely relying on, but it's not tenable when you move from 7 dependents to an old person to 1.5 dependents to a new person. It's not tenable. And then we have to relook at taxes and social insurance. Okay, so that's just the social security system. But that interface between the new normal in economics, new normal in politics, also has as its core a few other key social policies that have come under a lot of stress because of the forces I was talking about. And these are housing, education, healthcare, infrastructure, support and environment, and of course population, right? And the problem is not just that there are significant problems in each of these. The problem is that their problems are growing in all of these at the same time, right? And if you think about citizens facing problems on average citizens, in all of these areas at the same time, what does it amount to? It amounts to great stress on policy credibility and on the social compact, because people feel that the government is just not delivering the basics, bread and butter issues. And Singaporeans, I think, are very pragmatic lot of you need to deliver on bread and butter issues, of which these comprise an important part together, right? Now, all these things have in common few things. One, that they are not adequately provided by the market. The market does not provide, most of these are public goods, right? Through public housing. The market does not naturally provide these things. And yet, they are key to citizen well-being, right? And in fact, key to the Singapore dream, the idea that your kids can have a better life than you, especially when compared to other OECD countries, or even East Asian countries, right? Now, in the new normal, there's an additional problem. You can't just formulate the right policy and all these things and implement them. There needs to be actually public consensus and public collaboration in actually implementing solutions in all these areas, right? Which is even more difficult than coming up with solutions themselves. And there are also hard financial trade-offs to be made between these. And part of the problem, of course, is that we aren't even having a sensible national conversation about any of these, right? And one of the main reasons is, how do you have a sensible national conversation about any of these if you do not know your fiscal resources? So if you see how you can have a wish list, but if there are trade-offs, what is the trade-off? You need to know the budget, right? If you're going shopping and you have a limited number of items, you need to know the budget before you go to the shops, right? And if the amount that you have in your budget, in your wallet to go to the shops is classified information, how do you have a sensible discussion about the shopping, right? So essentially, and this is not just within the government and the public, between government departments, right? So how do we have this conversation? I don't know. But rethinking this, all these these things together is important. Let's take public housing. Okay, public housing. The SDP had an announcement of their housing plan yesterday. I was there. It's not that I'm a huge fan of the SDP, but when I saw the paper, I have to admit, it's very high quality paper. Okay? And this is precisely the kind of constructive, rigorous, competent policy that we want to encourage opposition parties to come up with, right? Rather than just talking in the air. And they made a great effort. But here are the issues. We have HDB, I would say, is Singapore's greatest social policy achievement. We've achieved public housing at a more affordable, higher quality rate than any other country in the world, Scandinavia included, right? Beat them hollow. But we are giving this advantage away. Why? Public housing, we have begun to link public housing prices to private property prices. And the whole advantage of therefore having private property, once you have a housing bubble, is fine for the first few years when we didn't have a housing bubble. But once you had a housing bubble, as in recent years, you rapidly find that your public housing is becoming unaffordable. And the HDB has to go through all kinds of contortions and put up all kinds of measured losses to provide the same kind of public houses, always under fire, right? So you've got to think about what is affordable housing. Now, entry-level flats now, let's say 3 to 4 room flats in Hougang, in Sengkang, are now closer to 4 times annual income versus 2 to 3, right? 2 to 3 was always what HDB was able to deliver, and quite often, even in the early years, closer to 2 than to 3. And this enabled repayment periods of 9 to 15 years. Think about it. So you're talking about 1/4 of your lifetime earning span, you can pay off your flat. Now you think this is a luxury? I don't think so, because you need the rest of the 3/4 of your earning life to pay off a lot of other things, right? What about education for your kids? What about healthcare? What about retirement adequacy, right? So these are big ticket items that you need to consider when you consider the price of public housing, but HDB does not consider that. HDB just says how long does it take? Can you pay off the loan even if it's 30 years? As long as you can pay off within your CPF, then housing is affordable, right? The problem is that you cannot decide on affordability of housing independent of the cost of other big ticket items like education, like health, or even transport. Consider how. So all these big ticket items, how do you squeeze in housing? So one advantage we have had as a nation is that we could make standard of living good by controlling this cost, but we've given it away. So what do we need to do? We need to find some way of delinking private market from HDB prices, the asset that we have, the social asset that we have, right? And, well, the SDP came up with a solution. They say have a segmented market. You build based on construction costs and administration. You take out the price of land, which you can do because you own 80% of the land. You bought it at historical cost, so it's much lower than market price, right? So they recognize the actual book value, subsidy is affordable, and anyway your citizen population is going to peak in 2020 and decline, right? So you have a limited number of people to take care of, and you can afford to do that. That's one solution, okay? So therefore you can only sell back to the government at what the cost you bought less the lease, consumed lease, right? That's one solution. But to me, that's a bit severe. I mean, I think that if you can still enable, I think, citizens to benefit from long-term property appreciation if you say let them sell after 10 years. Right? 10 years is longer than the property cycle. 10 years takes the speculative element out of housing, so they're forced to be a long-term investor, if you like. You can't buy and sell. So if you can do that, give each person one bite of the cherry, say that all PRs must buy from resale market, citizens only one bite of the cherry within the system, and you can sell 10 years later. Then at least citizens can benefit from the long-term growth of the economy, from the long-term overcrowding of the economy by the PRs who will then support your housing prices for you, right? And these offset some of the disbenefits they give to you by competing for your jobs and crowding Singapore, right? So you can have that kind of trade-off. So you can come up with an innovative policy to segment the market sufficiently. The other thing you need to do is to reconsider the sacred cow of ownership. Now, a lot of countries like Germany, there's only 60% home ownership, 50% home ownership. And there's a good reason for that. People at the bottom find it very difficult, and it's really not optimal for them to own homes all the time. We should encourage as many of them as possible that can to own, but we consider that we had 4 recessions in the last 13 years, and people at the bottom have hardly any savings, how do you expect them to service a mortgage through 4 recessions, right? There's going to be a large number of them just by statistically that will lose their flats. And so you've got to have, in this kind of economic environment, to get real and have a sufficiently large-scale, low-cost rental housing. Like in Hong Kong, I think 40% of the Hong Kong public housing is rental, right? And it's very successful. So why can't we consider that? And so we must be willing to think about slaughtering some sacred cows, home ownership for everybody. We have to give them the options, right? Let's take healthcare. Singapore and the US were the only 2 developed countries that did not have universal healthcare, right? So in other words, the bottom 20%, 30% have to fend for themselves. The rest have very high quality healthcare. Now with Obamacare, Singapore will be left standing as the only developed country that does not have universal healthcare, right? Unless Mitt Romney comes in and reverses, and then at least we have one other kaki there, right? But at the moment, as it is, healthcare is becoming increasingly unaffordable for the bottom 30%. It's not that visible yet because the population is still young, but as it ages, you will see this, especially since as we age, there's going to be 1.5 active people per old dependent compared to 7 to now, right? And the whole basis of our MediSave is also sharing and pooling between family members, right, siblings. Basis MediSave, MediShield, MediFund is just not enough to cope with the increase of medical costs and the shrinking of the demographic demand ratios, right? And if you look at MediShield, which is a pretty good effort, this is good risk pooling. Risk pooling is always a sound thing to do. We are unwilling to go, because we're so tied to individuals and the market, full way. We still, for example, risk pool within age cohorts. So that means 70, 80-year-olds in MediShield all risk pool together, 30, 40-year-olds. But what it means is that 30, 40-year-olds, because they're healthier, have a better rate, so you pay less. But by the time you get to 80, and you're pooled with all the other 80-year-olds, it's going to be unaffordable for the bottom 30% of the population. You have to pay up $400, $500 a month. Where are you going to find that kind of money when you retire, right? Between ages of 55 and 95? Got to be kidding, right? So it's a problem that you can see, it just doesn't work, but it's there. Nothing's been done about it yet. MediShield also is good in the sense it has a 90% subscription rate, but the 10% is precisely the 10% that needs the coverage the most. You know, pre-existing conditions, congenital conditions, you know, handicapped people. So why are we leaving them out? So this is essentially, universal healthcare is essentially a moral call. It's what kind of, can I be blunt? It's how civilized a society you want to be. Do you want to leave people out? Americans are fine with that, a lot of them who are in. Or do you think it's socially unacceptable, as the Canadians do, because universal healthcare is part of the Constitution in Canada. Right? It's a constitutional right. So it depends on your values as a society. This is not a normative thing. It's not positive, it's a normative thing. Also, of course, chronic and long-term primary care is not insurable at the moment. So, are we going to go for universal financial access? I will argue that as we age, we probably have to. And this will take up public spending from 1.5% to probably 4.5% of GDP. And right now, at one time we had more socialized medicine. At one time, out of total medical costs, government paid 2/3. This was in the 80s. We paid 1/3. And this ratio has been reversed today, right? You know, under the principle of individual payment and individual responsibility. There's no reason why it has to be that. WHO would recommend something closer to 33% to make healthcare universal. Right? So, is this a policy option that we are even discussing? I don't think so. Why not? Okay, education. Now we have one of the best education systems in the world in terms of pedagogic practices, test scores, really good schools, I think. The quality is definitely, you have to admit, it's really up there on the best. But where it fails is really, I would say, not so much in the quality of education, but in equality of opportunity. I would say that Singapore has an excellent education system, but it has an equally big shadow education system. What is that shadow education system? It's the tuition system, right? I don't know if you know this, but the biggest buyers of Lamborghini cars in Singapore are who?
Tuition teachers.
Tuition center owners. Yeah. Okay, so it shows you to what extent education system has become effectively by the shadow education system commercialized. Consider the cost of giving a kid the best chances in primary 6 to get to straight through program, to get to one of the top schools. You're talking, if you want to be serious, besides resigning, joining DBS and getting leave for PSLE, you're talking about giving a kid tuition in 4 subjects. So you're talking about a bill of at least $1,200 to $1,500 a month at primary school. When you get to secondary school and you've got 8 O-level subjects, you're talking about a $2,000 bill per kid per month, if you want to be in the running for the top schools, right? So the top 20% therefore spend 5 times more on education than the bottom 20%. What kind of level playing field is that? Right? And this is going to become very obvious. Now, what are the reforms needed here? We have to recognize the central function of education as one of the prime mechanisms of social mobility in society, right? We have to recognize that and recognize that we need to design it as such. If we value social mobility, if we don't, it's a different issue, right? If you don't, but if you don't, you've got to be prepared to face the public, right? So if you do, what are the best practices? 1, minimize streaming. Most countries, well, a lot of countries don't have a PSLE. In fact, no other country except us has a PSLE, let's be frank. So when the minister gets a lot of kudos, and rightly so, for making PSLE less granular in terms of how it ranks our kids, why don't we just say, hey, hello, why don't we just forget about PSLE, make secondary school compulsory, end of story. That's best practice. What are we arguing about? We can take Finland. Finland has no elite schools whatsoever. They have curriculum guidelines, but most teachers set their own curricula in the separate schools. Every teacher has a master's and an assistant. There are 15 to 20 students a class. They give individualized assessment. There's no mass assessment until just before university. Right? Complete freedom. There is hardly too much homework, except before class projects. And they score as well as we do in reading, science, and math at 15-year-old level, PISA scores, right? So there are alternative ways to get the same result without this kind of system. But what is the important thing that Finland has? It has social mobility, right? Not to mention a childhood for your kids, probably just as important as social mobility. Okay, so what kind of public expenditure are we talking about that is needed for these reforms? As you can see, just from healthcare alone, you're talking about 4-5% of GDP. But I would say that you need 4 to 5% of GDP from healthcare, you need 2 to 3% on education, you need 1 to 2% on social security, you need 1 to 2% on industrial policy, sensible industrial policy. You're talking about 10% of GDP. Where are we now? We're at 17% of GDP. You add 10%, you get 27% of GDP. You'll still be among the lowest public spending regimes in the world. So we're not talking about going to Scandinavia at 55%. We're just talking about getting as sensible as Korea at 27% or Taiwan. So what are our possible futures? This is what we have presently. MNC-led industrial development, manufacturing sector key, high immigration intensive, minimal individual and family reliance, minimal welfare market driven. Perhaps we can move to more SME local industry capability development. We can still have manufacturing important, but perhaps not so overwhelmingly important, but focusing on selected high value chain capabilities. We can have a modest 3 to 4% growth instead of a 5 to 7% growth. Productivity intensive. Low immigration rate, close to 0.5% of workforce growth. And to make sure that this is redistributed in wages, we need to revive tripartism, right? Because for example, in the US, productivity growth has outstripped wage growth for the last 20 years. So without enough institutional support, these benefits are not going to be distributed to workers, right? But we have a workable tripartite process that we can revive to make sure that this happens. We need stronger state activism in housing, healthcare, etc., social security, infrastructure. And what kind of institutions do we need? Maybe we need a champion for the SMEs. We need to develop them into industries that you can see, for example, in Germany, right? Germany has one of the strongest export sectors in the SMEs in the world. They produce half of their exports. And Germany, high value added exports beats China all over even now, right? A whole range of industries. We need largely high-skilled immigration with minimal low-skilled immigration. We need to maybe double the rate of investment in education. We need to guide wage increases in line with productivity. We need affordable social policy, and we need to build civic infrastructure. Okay, that's all I have at the moment, and maybe you can just bring it up.
I think nowadays the most common people they feel is most of them will target around $400,000 for a foreign flat. I think that's about the what they call the middle class. So I think most of them have difficulty to pay out, and that's why the 40,000 grant I think is certainly not enough. Obviously, on and on we hear people, the government say they might want to review that grant. What that's a reflection of it. I'm obviously looking at a much bigger picture. Why 15 years ago you need to earn 3 years of salary to be able to afford a flat. Now I think you probably double that. And that scenario is growing. So the question is, that's why the affordability, the whole concept and the whole message, when people say about affordability, is always been misinterpreted.
I think it's very depressing. very depressing. But although it's depressing, you're also very optimistic, and the solutions are so clear-cut, right? 10% of GDP and all that it takes to just spend that lousy 10% and then all problems will be solved. And yet, why are we dragging our feet? Why? What's the problem? What is the problem? Is it because we are something called a state capitalist system, and the beneficiaries of state capitalism refuses to give up their largesse? Maybe you're one of the few that is in the process of giving it up, apart from Lim Chong Ya and Yan Dong Dao. But the rest stick fast to it. So what's the problem?
I want to know really what are there any figures in Singapore about what is the profit margin for different industries? Because if, let's say, building industry, most architects drive cheap cars, most contractors drive Mercedes, which means that their profit margin must be pretty high, and they are employing Bangladeshis and cheap labor, and they don't want to improve productivity. The question that I want to ask is this: you mentioned Australian construction workers. In Singapore, we had a small group that came to do a renovation of a terrace house. There were 3 of them. They came in a van which was filled with equipment. Every 2 hours they have tea break. But they finished the project in half the time of a Singapore contractor. And they made money. Because they were a cooperative. They worked as a team. They kept the profits to themselves. So they did not have to pay, therefore they had higher wages. Why can't we do this? Why is it that ITE, polytechnics are not training people, not teaching people how to run their own cooperative business? I mentioned this thing to you, Patrick, about the Mondragon experiment, right? Which is in the Basque region in Spain. They have 100,000 factory workers who own their factories. It's a cooperative. They own their own bank. They have 27 cooperatives. They own their own university. They own their own school. Why can't we do this in Singapore? Is there a private agreement between the Singapore government and the big multinational corporations to suppress labor?
Okay, okay, three very interesting points. I think just take them now before I forget and other more complicated points arise. I think, okay, taking Boon's point first, I think I agree that, housing is probably the most immediately felt reform that people would probably demand right now, right? The others, like medical will make itself felt over time. Education, people are still too caught up in the current education race to really realize the options, but they will realize it. Now, I want to talk a bit about the pricing of flats and social services in general, because first of all, what you're interested is in quality of life for citizens, right? And this is the essence of the Singapore dream, that you feel each generation that your kids are able to live in a better, higher quality environment, more opportunity than you. Actually, the prices of all these things determine this a lot. If you just think about it and think about these things in the context of Australia, Canada, other locations, right? If you were to, in Australia, think of how much you have to pay for housing versus education versus healthcare. You add it up together and then you think about it in those terms, right? And so therefore, we have to think about welfare for our citizens in this respect. And we're handicapped in many respects because we're a city-state, very scarce land, right? Whereas in Australia and America, you have so much land, take care of housing costs. But what we do have is we have strong fiscal resources, and we have a working institution like HDB, right? We have a working institution like the CPF. We have a good, very strong Ministry of Education, right? We have very good infrastructure and transportation potential facilities. I'm asking you a simple question. Why did we publicly list SMRT? Why the hell did we publicly list it? Why couldn't we have made it a corporation, just like Singapore Changi Airport? Don't you think that they're both equivalent types of high contingency, high demand kind of facilities? Don't you think that if we had the governance of SMRT like the governance of Changi Airport, we had a much better outcome in public transport? Why did we do that? Right? Also, we have the ability, as long as MOE gets together, MOH gets together with CPF, gets together with LTA, we can really jointly price quality living in Singapore in a sustainable way within the budget that we have, right? Why is this not being done? Why is it that even at the level of HDB, they don't really think of housing in terms of affordability as an opportunity cost of a lifetime versus other costs? Can you really think of retirement in separate from housing or education or healthcare? You can't. And we have the capability precisely in Singapore because of the asset I mentioned, right? A very strong civil service, very strong fiscal resources to price all these things reasonably. So this is the opportunity that we have to deliver something that is really high citizen well-being, and we are not maximizing that potential. We're not even thinking about it. Because we have chosen instead to allocate these things by the market and via individual responsibility. Now, getting back to Patrick's point, so why would they change, right? It's 10% of GDP, 12% of GDP, it's also doable. Half-baked economists with fishes most of the time can think of these things. So how come the government can't think of these things, right? I think one of the reasons is, honestly, I don't think the reason is because they have such a strong vested interest in it. I think it's much more simple reason is that they have done this thing like this for the last 15 years, and they've made policies like market-based policies for the last 15 years, so much so that to change what they are doing now, they will have to admit that these policies were not so good. A lot of people who formulated these policies are in positions of power, right? So it's more just the inertia of incumbency. It's a bit like how come BlackBerry cannot change when confronted with Apple. It's a bit like how come Nokia can't change when confronted with touchscreen and Android OS, right? It's more of that nature, and less of, I think, of vested interest. I think the state here has an unusually autonomous ability to think about public welfare compared to a lot of other states. Singapore, I mean, I'm not saying completely, but Singapore government is capable of thinking of its citizens, as long as it thinks in the right way. But unfortunately, I think over the last 20 years, they have been captured by this market fundamentalist and what I would call neoliberal ideas of leaving everything to the market. And if you talk to people in civil service, they will admit this themselves, right? And they will point the finger to the other ministries, like you see the other ministries, but not my ministry here. So this is the kind of problem that we have right now, right? And I think that it's not enough of political leadership to really break out of this mold. Right? And it's ironic because actually, if you think about it, it is in the ruling party's own long-term interest to look after these issues before they are taken to task by the electorate, right? So the inertia of incumbency is so large that it even obscures their own political interests, which is ironic. You find yourself trapped in an organization that cannot save itself, like the LDP, or BlackBerry, or Nokia, right? So this is ironic, right? But people find themselves trapped in these organizations. So you talk to any minister, any junior minister, and he tell you the same thing. What can I do? Really, this kind of story, right? Even some of the senior ministers might tell you that in a more private moment, right? So, I think that's more the nature of why things are slow to change. But I think that is whether or not they can change, right? Whether or not before 2016, before 2021, before it's too late, they can actually change and do some of these things. And we're not talking about rocket science policies, right? The measures that I'm talking about, the SDP can come up with it yesterday, right? And come up with a healthcare plan that is just as good 3 months before, right? We're talking about SDP, right? But they did a bloody good job. They can, because they've enlisted concerned citizens to do it, right? Concerned citizens with the expertise to do it. It shows you two things, and there are a lot of positives in this. One is that there are people out there, there is expertise out there, there is citizenry participation out there that can be mobilized to come up with the answers, right? If only the authorities can tap on them. So the whole exercise of collaborative policy making in these key areas is no pipe dream. I mean, that's it, right? So don't tell me that if you in national conversation you can't do better than that. You can, right? Okay, not okay. But I see why Pang is saying cannot. But I mean, if you cannot or you can, it's a very important thing in this following way. If there is not sufficient policy reform in these areas, then you will lose policy credibility. If you lose policy credibility, you lose a very important asset. You lose the ability to make difficult long-term policy as a government. And then you end up like America, right? And I don't think Singapore can afford to lose that kind of capability, because then you're at the mercy of populist politics, right? You only pander to the electorate. That's one. The second thing is that you may have to force the electorate and Singapore into a political crisis before you actually implement these policies, right? And that's even more irresponsible. So are you going to force us into a political crisis before you do eminently reasonable policy? So that's the bad news. But the good news is, should such a crisis happen, there is enough depth in the civil service, and there's sufficient depth out there in civil society for us to right ourselves quite fast. So I would say, contrary to the view that Singapore is very vulnerable in that respect, we are vulnerable, we are also very resilient in that respect. And there is a distinct possibility of bouncing back from that scenario. So that was Patrick, and then the third was King Soon. And I think King Soon, you're right in the sense that there are two things here. One is that we are entirely capable of being as productive as the Australians or the Hong Kongers in construction or any other industry, as long as we face the same rational price structure. If you make labor less available, you'll be forced to be like the Australians, right? Right now, it's much more profitable for the developers to be like they are rather than the Australians, right? So you can reform industry in that respect. Can you encourage more new forms of cooperative participation? I think we have precisely within our GLC structure the potential to do that. Believe me, look at NTUC Income. What is NTUC Income? It's a cooperative, essentially, right? NTUC Income runs insurance company, but essentially you look at the mission and objectives, they are a cooperative venture. Right? They were formed as a cooperative. Okay, some of the biggest, most successful retail chains today, John Lewis is a cooperative, right? So, given that we have such big GLCs, it's possible entirely to rearrange it such that they become cooperatives, and therefore you have a big chunk of Singapore as a cooperative sector, if you want to structure it like that, right? John Lewis is not less competitive than any of the other big retail firms. Right? NTUC Income is not less cooperative than Aviva, less competitive than Aviva, just as so, can be just as so, right? This is entirely within the range of our policy options, but it is not within the range of our policy mindsets.
Why?
Because we're so used to thinking like this.
We can,
I can answer that, but I think I'll let
Firstly, I think the gentleman over there was saying that he's very depressed. I mean, looking at your timeline, I think being one of those who actually see the tail end of the reality, I think I'm even more depressed. Because I think you mentioned that part of the thing that you think that people cannot change is because of the lethargy or I think it's about ideology. It's basically that. And I think underlying the ideology is very, apathetic is a good word to describe them. I think a more negative word would be sadistic. I mean, because, and it's like looking at how they arrange the welfare system and how people are taken through the welfare system. I mean, the kind of private humiliations they face. I mean, the kind of the things that the mindset actually is scary. And you mentioned that maybe one day you will lead up to a political crisis, which then will let the civil service to correct itself. My fear is that that this political sadism has seeped into people's popular culture, people's imagination, and people's way of thinking. I mean, if you look at social media also, I mean, you can see that there is the desire to punish and desire to hurt people rather than correcting things, and this has happened before. I mean, in many authoritarian countries, I mean, once the autocrat falls, it's not writing of it becomes even more sadistic. It becomes fascist. I mean, I'm thinking of a place like Germany. So I think that is my concern. That of course you have competent people who are technically competent, but the heart, the mindset, the what they want to do might be quite scary. I mean, I don't know, maybe in future Singapore will be the net exporter of poor people. We export our poor people overseas. I mean, that is the kind of thing.
Actually, there are already tales of or stories about construction workers, mid-level manager types working in Dubai on a contractual seasonal basis. But they're probably still a small minority. Sorry, my comments were that there are two basic comments. One was, can I ask you to go back to a slide that you skipped, the one that has got at the bottom something about city-state versus mega city. I was just curious as to yeah, all right. Okay, that's population. But in direct response to Mr. Taking Soon about and yourself about how the mindset has not changed regarding SMEs and how we lack the creation of really workable cooperatives. There is a historical, I'm painting this with a broad brush, but there is a historical precedent and a historical idea that's quite relevant. Basically, creating a stronger SME sector through, say, cooperatives and other forms would imply and possibly entail the creation of an independent, of a politically independent middle class that would fill the ranks of civil society and opposition parties to eventually challenge the PAP. That's theory based on many other countries that are Eastern Europe, or rather the suppression of them in Eastern Europe.
And that is why it is suppressed.
Yeah, that is the political precedent. Yeah. Of course, not all of it's based on theory. There is So again, it's a broad brush, but there you go.
In an interview with the Straits Times that came out in May, you mentioned that you went into econs because Mr. Daman said it was more useful. Are you still sort of in contact with the guy? Have you fed back any of these things? Because I don't quite share your view of them as being rather benign, but apathy and the rest of it. Because in the last budget, instead of maybe helping the bottom 30% by getting rid of GST for basic foodstuffs, just a few basic foodstuffs, he got rid of GST for investment in gold and silver. What do you think of that?
Maybe Alex.
Hi. My name is Owen Pang. Just a simple thing on the investment in gold and silver and GST. In fact, I was just about to ask you this as my second priority question, but I'll come to that just very quickly. There's this movement now that's talking in economics, I think, that's talking about the need to tax income from capital as opposed to income from labor. I think in the last 50 years or so, we've really focused on taxing income from labor, and we've left income from capital. And that's why in the last generation or so, a lot of people have shifted their attention to basically earning a living from assets. And this may be one of the reasons why we've had a series of bubbles, because work is now less profitable than investing in assets. And in the long run, of course, it's really bad for an economy, and that's why we have all these property bubbles. People are more focused on buying gold, buying property, and goodness knows what. But that's a separate comment. Maybe you want to say something about it later. My main comment is this, and it springs from what King Sun said. In fact, I am particularly pessimistic about Singapore's ability to improve our productivity. And there's a reason why I'm going to say that. We can forcibly deal with poverty by just simply changing the terms of power between the poor and the rich. But that would simply mean that for the same low-wage worker doing exactly the same mind-numbing job, that person is just paid 4 times more. That can create all sorts of cost-push inflationary pressures, but you would deal with the problem of poverty just like that. Obviously, that's not a sustainable long-term solution. You have to do something about productivity. And I think Singapore is going to struggle to improve productivity. Why? One, because there's a large section of our population, right up to the people in their 40s today, who lack good grounding education. And it's very hard for them to acquire new skills if they do not have a good grounding in English, in mathematics, in science and all that. It's very hard to train them in new skills. And that's the weakness of an education system over the last generation that has focused on the elite and basically did not focus on the 60 or 65% who went to the neighborhood schools. And now they come out, they can't even read a proper instruction manual because the English is so weak. How do you upgrade? Secondly, if you want to upgrade and you want to attend additional courses, you need time. You need to be able to attend classes at night. The average Singaporean is working, 11 hours a day, And you say, what, stop work for 6 months to attend a course? How can I stop work for 6 months? Because I'm already living from hand to mouth, I've got a mortgage to service, and things like that, right? I've got older parents to look after. I can't stop work for 6 months to attend a course. If that is the case, then you have all these existing barriers to people investing time in upgrade. First of all, the ability to upgrade is limited by poor general education. Secondly, even now, they cannot invest in it. They have neither the financial or time resources to invest in upgrading. So it's a real problem. We are now, so it's all very well to say that yes, all this is attainable. The question is that transition between now to there that you have sketched as the future is terribly difficult. All right, and that is why sometimes when the transition is difficult, no matter how ideal, how wonderful your future is, you may never get to the future because you can't get past your transition. And that is what I worry about in Singapore.
Sorry, this may be a stupid question because I'm coming at this with very little background, but in relation to some of the points that were mentioned earlier, especially in regard to revenue policy, right? I believe gold and silver, GST was mentioned, exemption of those two from GST. But it seems as though if you look at the government state's revenue policy, let's say for instance, our low corporate tax rate, we have no estate tax, if I remember correctly, we don't have much in the way of capital gains, which generally tax labor income as opposed to capital gains. It seems that, would you, from your perspective, do you think that our revenue policy links to perhaps a broader economic or industrial policy of encouraging high net worth individuals to come in here? And secondly, which was really my main point before everyone else brought up the other stuff, right? I wanted to ask, from your perspective, right, knowing more of the data than I suspect most of us in the room, right? How do you think that, I mean, the spending suggestions you make seem pretty reasonable, especially in light of our low rate of public spending compared to other OECD nations and so on. But how would you, what perhaps are some of the opportunities, the problems, or the trade-offs involved in raising the revenue? Do you think that it's going to be a difficult problem getting there, for instance?
Okay, there's a number of really good points that we brought up. The first point, I think, Fadli's point about, you know, politics of envy and discontent versus constructive policy collaboration, right? And I think that that's a real risk, and it's a risk because of what I would call moral hazard. Moral hazard of the position of government is the government, if you thought about it, the single agency that can encourage widespread civil society participation in politics in a constructive way, the most decisive is the government, right? So for example, by just simply having free mainstream media, right? Freedom of Information Act, these simple institutional reforms would encourage a much vaster amount of public discussion and debate. You know, for example, Finland, same population as us, has 250 independent newspapers, 4 independent radio stations. Right? So a lot of the debates are actually carried out in those fora, rather than, you know, a group of ministers having to go door to door and group to group, like in days of old, right? Paul Revere's days. What do you think about the national conversation? Ding ding. Right? Because the mainstream media is not going to do it for you, right? Now, and in the social media, they are absent from dialogue, right? They're absent, missing in action. Most other countries have an active social media policy between several, Hong Kong, several state agencies and the public, all the time, right? Taiwan, same, we're absent. We give announcements in social media, but there's no genuine dialogue. Maybe a few ministers are able to do that now and then on their Facebook messages, but not as a government policy, communications policy, right? Missing in action. So if you're missing in action in social media and mainstream media is shut down, how do you communicate as a society? But consider, is it in the government's interest to make mainstream media free? Or to participate more wholeheartedly in social media? It is not, right? So there is a moral hazard here, right? The agency that has the most power to encourage public debate has a direct interest, hanging on to power, in not doing it. So there's a moral hazard situation here, right? So in that sense, perhaps the government is not acting in Singapore's best interest in not liberalizing the media, for example, to a much faster extent than they are doing now, right? So this is a problem of a transition that we are talking about. You know, not everything that is in the interest of citizens is in the interest of the ruling government, right? And this is the issue of separation of powers. This just doesn't bedevil us. Most countries face the same thing, right? I mean, consider the banking lobby in America and how it's captured, you know, money politics in America. So, you know, even America has those problems, right? So we're not alone, but it is a problem. And to Fadli's point, I think, therefore, citizens groups therefore have to take it upon themselves to encourage this kind of constructive debate among each other and with the government, right? So for example, take the SDP Public Housing Policy Report yesterday, right? I think for the second time in Singapore history, an opposition party has come up with a very significant policy document. The first was the healthcare policy, right? Hardly much in it in the Straits Times at all, about that much, right? And a little bit on the online media. Chao Pao had a better coverage of it, right? But this is precisely the kind of behavior from opposition parties that you should be encouraging, is it not? Coming up with coherent, responsible, constructive, competent policies. Isn't that what you want from the opposition? Rather than what? Crazy populist policy, right? So that needs to be encouraged, right? And but I think that for us, compared to a lot of other transitional societies, let's compare, let's say, for example, Taiwan after Jiang Jingguo, or Spain after Franco, right? And look at the transitions to democracy, or even Indonesia after Suharto, right? And look at the transitions to democracy. I mean, Indonesia today is doing remarkably well. It's got one of the most free presses in the region, you know, by the way, Indonesia. Whereas for us, I think the Burmese government just announced that they're targeting the independence of press to be somewhere in between Singapore at the bottom and Thailand at the top. This is the announced policy of the Burmese government. They don't want to be there, but I think they don't want to be here, somewhere in the middle. But if you consider those transitions, I think we have a better, I disagree with Wai Pang here, that I think we have a better chance of coming out historically relatively smoothly, in the sense that if you look at the bureaucracy, you know, after the fall of Jiang Jingguo, right, it was completely partisan to the KMT, and also it's very corrupt and inefficient. I mean, there's no way that they could have come with any other kind of alternative policy, even if they tried, right? Consider the difference with our civil service, right? If you just give the order to most of our, even forget about director level, deputy director level and below, you tell them, for example, Ministry of, take anyone, let's say, health, come up with a universal healthcare system, you'll see it in 2 weeks, and you'll see a damn good one. Right? So they are all capable of it because they've been trained, they've been exposed, they have the capability, they just need the direction. Right? So there is a very big resilience built in to the institutional capability of our civil service. I think we have to recognize this, and this is an asset. Right? This is what's going to give us our downside resilience in a lot of these bad scenarios. Right? And this is independent of the ruling party. Right? So I think that in that sense, I'm not that pessimistic as either Fadli or Wai Pang. I think, you know, I mean, I was very impressed with the SDP paper. I mean, it was just, you know, Yang Yan Hoi and some people, some concerned doctors came up with, and Paul Tambia came up with the healthcare proposal. And then recently, you know, young operations specialist, PhD plus Yan Hoi and his group, and they came up with a housing paper. A very high quality, very high quality pieces of work, as good as any as I've seen in government. Right? And they can just do it by drawing on part-time resources in the population. It shows you how well educated segments of our population are and how competent they are, and actually that the monopoly of such expertise, that there's a monopoly of such expertise within the ruling party or within the government, it's not quite correct. Right? There's considerable resiliency and ability for our own civil society to come back if we just give it half a chance, in this case a quarter of a chance, in this case not even a tenth of a chance, if you look at the reporting in the Straits Times. Right? So on the contrary, I think, relatively speaking, institutionally, and even on current record, I think I'm quite optimistic in that regard. What I'm not sure about is how long it will take for that shift to take place, whether or not we have to, whether we need a political crisis first to get us there, or is the reform going to become, from government, preemptive to that crisis? A bit like what's happening in the Eurozone right now. Is it preemptive reform or is it crisis-forced reform? I think is the key critical uncertainty for a lot of our political scenarios. And I hope for citizens' sake that it's preemptive reform. Right? So, I mean, that might benefit the ruling party, but I mean, it's better than forcing a crisis on the population. I don't know. So, in Kenneth shaking his head. The other point about my friend who's the Deputy Prime Minister right now. I mean, I haven't really been in contact with him on policy issues, but we've talked about things generally. I don't really know his inner thoughts on these issues. I can sense that he's perhaps more aware of these issues and these alternatives as real alternatives. I don't know. I do not know. I can imagine that it's very difficult for him within a party structure like that, and with cabinet colleagues like that, to really bring things out or really change things. It's like if you were suddenly a senior executive in Research in Motion or in Nokia, right? Parachute you in tomorrow, and you know everything you know today. Do you think you can change the fortunes of Nokia or Research in Motion? I don't think so, right? No matter how high up in that. So there is a certain difficulty in reform from within, and I hope that they're able to gain enough, reformists within the party are able to gain enough traction to at least move us forward sufficiently. I mean, for two reasons. One is, I don't think that all these reforms should awake a political crisis. I mean, and the poor need to be helped tomorrow or next week, not after the crisis in 5 or 10 years' time. Right? Our educational healthcare system needs to be reformed soon, right? And the pity of it is that because of the tremendous, I mean, ironically, because of the tremendous improvements in these areas that, to their credit, the ruling party has built up over the years, we are within quite close distance of very significant sustainable reform in these areas that will really improve, the quality of life of our citizens in a sustainable way. It is possible. We have the means of production, if you like, are strong enough to do that. Right? It just requires that last 30% bit of reform. And if you think about what's actually involved, turning SMRT from a publicly listed corporation to a corporation like China, it's not as though it's a revolution, right? Jeez. But for us it is, right? It's a revolution in mindsets, as opposed to a revolution in any kind of organizational practice. But that's the last, I think, gap that we have to capital and labor, sorry. Yeah, I forgot. Capital and labor, I do agree. The distribution of GDP globally, income distributions everywhere have swung far too much towards capital. I mean, if you look at the ratio of top executives, the CEO to the shop floor worker, let's say if you take it historically from the end of the Second World War right up to the 1980s, it was about 50 times, 60 times in all jurisdictions, right? And since the mid-80s, it has gone to about 200 times in the US, and it's remained roughly there in Japan and has gone in between in Europe, right? So don't tell me that in all that period, from the World War II until the 1980s, the world was not progressing, growing, entrepreneurial. Clearly not the case, right? So a significant redistribution of income is therefore possible with significant efficiency and entrepreneurial drive still remaining very dynamically within the free market system. And what we are seeing right now historically, I think we look back on as being excessive. An excess that we haven't seen since the 1920s in America, right? The time of the Great Gatsby, when Fitzgerald said the rich are not like us, like something else. So, but I think that that kind of reform globally is probably going to take place over the next few decades. I don't know to what extent, but I think that the pendulum is beginning to swing back in that direction.
Just looking at, say, the housing situation, I don't think that our 85% living in HDB was because the government actually had this idea that that they wanted to have better welfare for the people. It was probably in there. But you look at some of the early literature, the housing, the growth of the HDB basically was propelled by the thought that they wanted the population to have a part of Singapore. And that was one of the key things I think that they wanted to, the HDB, a stake in the country. Yeah, that's right, a stake in the country. And that has gone completely, out of the window today. And really, I think the issue today, as we look into the whole situation, is really, a crisis of leadership. As Pat Lowe says, the answers are so obvious, but yet, if they don't even throw the 10%, of the GDP, as some sort of welfare support. The whole thing is that, they are not prepared to do that, and it's just not in their thinking, to actually provide that welfare. And I think that the situation will be that, there will be a lot of contentions as we move forward.
Take advantage of holding the mic. You kept saying all this mindset, and I believe it is a very narrow, selfish mindset that our leaders somehow seem to have. Look at the casinos. It's like, it's okay, I have all these policies to protect my people. At least $100 they must pay before going in. But all foreigners are welcome. They can lose their pens, they can have family breakups, it's okay. But not for my people. But it's happening to our own people, not to mention our neighbors across the causeway, where at one point there are buses going in to send the poor housewives out from Seremban to gamble in Singapore. So this whole idea that outside my own backyard, anything else goes, we have to change that. So that kind of thinking, not only does it impact our own people, so this thing about not spending the 10%, it extends to our region and university. We might do small things like have the Singapore International Foundation go out and do some good deeds, encourage volunteers. But deep down, this idea of having industries and economic cooperation, social cooperation, political cooperation throughout the region, I think we have to somehow make that a reality and not just say anything that is good for us, keep it.
Can I respond to that straight away? Because I also want to respond to this young gentleman's question about the transitionary taxation regime and fiscal resource regime that needs to be in place to afford I wouldn't say a welfare state, but a reasonable level of social protection for people. Right? I want to say a few things about this. The first is that we already have significant fiscal resources. So by most people's agreement, we just have to raise taxes a little more to be able to afford what we want to do, let's say 10, 12% GDP in a sustainable way. Sustainable means you don't have to accumulate debt. That every year you run a balanced budget structurally long run. Right? That's certainly achievable with modest increase in taxation. So perhaps we're talking about moving from 20% tax on top income rates to maybe 25-30% top income rates. We're talking about maybe more environmental taxes, adjusting it up as we would have to do anyway with global warming and protocols. And we'll probably be there. Okay. So it is entirely doable in that sense. But also, I think there's the question of, as you alluded to, what is the what is it? What is the when you look at all these things? When you look at all these things, and you say you want to provide it for your people, and you want to provide it cooperatively by having enough fiscal resource, by having enough taxation, and you're willing to do that, what does it mean? It means it's not just a relationship in the social compact with the rules, right? It's also a relationship with each other as citizens, right? You're saying that we have enough solidarity, we care enough for each other to do it. And the interesting thing that is, as a behavioral economist, is if you go to Sweden, even these highest tax rate countries, right, we talk to most of the population, they're quite happy to pay 55% taxes because they feel it goes a long way to help the people who need it and achieve social solidarity. And they say, I'm proud of it as a Swede, I'm proud of it as a Dane, you know, I'm proud of it as a Finn, you know. Of course, there are a minority who will be tax refugees, right, like the Beatles, etc. But most, vast majority, the system works. Most of the people are quite proud to pay those kind of taxes. We're not even talking about those kind of tax rates. And I would say also that, look, I think policymakers tend to underestimate the propensity for people to have a certain level of altruism. Man is a social creature, and they did this behavioral economics experiment. You've got a big group of Republicans, a big group of Democrats, hardcore, both sides, big sample. They asked them, what is the income distribution in America right now? Right, top 20% versus bottom 20%. Most of them gave their answers, and they were way off. I mean, they all thought it was much more equal than it actually was. Interesting thing is the Democrats and Republicans also thought it was roughly the same as each other. Right? They weren't very different from each other, very different from the reality. And then they asked them, how equal do you think America should be, given this is how you think it is? They didn't tell them the reality, of course. And interesting thing is that all the Republicans wanted a more equal distribution than what they thought was existing, and the distribution that they wanted was more equal than Sweden's. Right? It was not very different from the Democrats, right? So here, you know, Republicans actually want to be like Sweden, but they just don't know it, right? They're just not able to get there because of these debates about whether to raise my taxes and ideology. But I think it masks a certain, to me, first two issues. One, there is a basic altruism in most people that does like a certain amount of equality of opportunity. And I don't think that is very human, because I think human beings are conditioned to understand that they can only exist if they hang together as a society. And this is in our DNA, right? That's the first point. Second point is that this, however, is a function of how unequal the society is. In other words, the longer you stay as an unequal society, the more difficult it is to get people to agree to help each other, because the social classes tend to stratify with them. So, for example, right now in Singapore, I don't know if you've noticed this, Singaporeans are really materialistic. I don't know if you've noticed. Damn materialistic, right? We are just embarrassingly materialistic, can I say, right? At the same time, Singaporeans are quite compassionate. Would you agree? Actually, if you look at the responses in the papers to when people, you know, a maid falls down of a window, this one has a tragedy, and suddenly $50,000 appears in the Straits Times, you know. So Singaporeans, on the one hand, are embarrassingly materialistic, but they are also touchingly compassionate. Now, this is a paradox. Why is this so? I think it's because of our economic history. We are just recently wealthy, and therefore we are still chasing wealth avidly, but we can remember very clearly within our experience of our own lifetimes, our parents, our cousins, our uncles, our school friends, who came from, we have experienced been in their homes, seen the difficult conditions, seen their life struggles, and we can feel for it as a result. It is not too distant in our memory, that we cannot feel for the less fortunate. Most of us sitting in this room have this experience, right? But you wait another 1 or 2 generations, when incomes, your kids have started going to RGS and Wachong, and they don't know anybody except people in ACS, and your kids will have a different experience of identifying with the less fortunate. They will. It's just natural, right? So the time to make this transition to a more caring society is now, right? Before, in a certain sense, before it's too late. Right? It's because income inequality itself breeds social mobility, which itself lowers social cohesion, right? And destroys social cohesion. That's shown clearly in literature. Right? If you read the recent literature on social capital, in the US, Bowling alone, etc., etc. Right? So, the problem here is that who is the agent that can coordinate a more equal society? It is government. Right? I mean, can we individually coordinate a more equal society? You cannot. You cannot do it without the government. The government has to do the heavy lifting to actually create the structural conditions for more equal society, for more equality of opportunity. I won't say equal society, right? And equality of opportunity, I think, is really at the heart of political legitimacy. Right? So when we say, we the citizens of Singapore, to build a democratic society based on justice and equality, we're not just saying justice in terms of legal justice, we're talking about social justice, right? And equality.
From what we say and what has been discussed so far, it seems that government is a very crucial element in this moment of transition, and I think I agree with you that the moment is now. When we talk about government, of course, we're talking about the civil service, right? And the political guys. I think the political guys have their own mindset, which I think is something else, which was derived from their mentor. Now, the question I think we need to ask ourselves is, what is the possibility of change within the civil service? I think we know pretty well that there are basically 2 strata. I mean, in some of my discussions with very interesting younger civil servants, I can see that there's a big difference between them and the guys I used to battle with. What's the prospect of a change in the civil service? Will we get whistleblowers? Will we get a kind of a revolt within the younger generations within the civil service? Maybe we should count on that.
No, I think really you should count on that. It's not going to happen. But I would say one thing. I think, we look at the ethos of government. What is government? Government is the political leadership and the civil service. And in Singapore's case, as Chan Heng Chee has pointed out, the political structure, actually politics, if you like, has been made obsolete, right? It's been emptied out, has been hollowed out. I mean, you look at the political cadreship within the PAP, it's an empty shell, really. They have limited career options. They feel just as oppressed as any one of you sitting in this room, and they feel just as discriminated against by the elites and frustrated, right? There's really no political cadreship that is really active or that is really dynamic or really functioning as such. There's just political leaders and the civil service, right? That's essentially government in Singapore. And but I would just take you back to, and that's the structure that was created, but I would just take you back to the political leadership as it originally was, let's say in the ex-mentors generation, right? I mean, among his peers, a lot of these ideas would have been self-evident.
Yes.
Affordable housing, tick.
Yeah.
Educational mobility, tick, tick. Socialized medicine, tick. Infrastructure, comfort, and environment, that was much better than anything they've seen before, tick, tick. Population and immigration policy, tick. Right? Lee Kuan Yew himself said, in the early 90s, I do not envision a Singapore bigger than 4 to 5 million. It is going to be impossible to sustain. Recently, he said in the papers, we cannot have our morals and our values as citizens determined by new citizens. We might as well close shop, unquote. How is it different from anything I've said today, right? They were essentially a socialist party, right? The government came from the left. It was essentially a social democratic party founded on social democratic values and a social democratic social policy. And we've lost our way from the 90s onwards into the bog, into the netherworld of market fundamentalism, basically, from which we're still wandering around like a lost tribe in, hopefully it won't take 40 years to come back to it, right? But essentially, I think if they return to their roots, these are their roots. Are these not their roots? That's essentially, they need to reclaim their pragmatic social democratic roots, right? But the new normal means it's not just, as Dr. Goh Keng Swee used to like to think, the socialism that works. He wrote a book, right? Socialism that works. He's the guy, by the way, who set up NTUC as a cooperative, right? Socialism that works. Today's challenge for the government is that you cannot have a socialism anymore. You have to have a social democracy that works. You have to engage democratically society, civil society, right? It's too complex, it's too difficult, it's too impossible to govern without that kind of relationship, right? Without the institutions that go along with it. And so therefore, one of the big reasons why they don't go headlong into this is because they will run up very quickly against a lot of things, I think, that will make them realize they also need to think about issues like, free mainstream media, freedom of information act, freedom, participating in social media, freedom of assembly, so genuine political reform, therefore, it's hard to divorce in this day and age from this kind of reform, right? Because this involves a social vision. It involves you actually discussing the trade-offs between all these things, given your limited budget with the population. Right? How are you going to do that effectively? It's quite difficult if you don't engage people and get them buy into your social vision, engage in a real political process. Right? So I think that's also the other part of the challenge that is difficult. Okay, sorry, talking in this okay, then
last question. Last comment.
Actually interesting as I'm listening to you. So you are saying that there had already been a mindset change from the so-called beginning, right? So there's this change to market economics within government, within the bureaucracy. And personally, being in the welfare sector, I experienced that, the MCYS and now all these new ministries, they tender out social services to the VWOs. So what is a tender process? Precisely is market oriented, so it's economics based. So the ministry themselves, unlike you, I would wish to be very optimistic, and I hope you will, change my mind about it. Is this whole idea of farming out social services, destitute institute, center for prevention of child abuse. What has happened to the ministries? What responsibility do they take? Similarly, that SMRT, the contractor didn't check this, or the contractor didn't check that. So what is the, I am feeling, and in a way, MOE, having this shadow tuition industry, isn't it also like contracting out part of the education to the private sector and say that, okay, it's not my problem now? Being a parent is very common, I think most of the parents here experience. It's the parents and the tutors that are in charge of teaching your kids. What the school does, they test them, right? Test. Okay, you fail, sorry, call the parent-teacher meeting. How come your child is not performing? Right? So the whole, I don't know whether I should be pessimistic, although you say, the civil service wow, these people are so well trained, they're scholars and all that, but they seem to be renouncing their responsibility. Why is the Ministry of Health not responsible for health? Why is the Ministry of, well, now they have changed all the titles of the ministries, not responsible for child abuse, not responsible for homelessness, but they farm it out to the VWOs, and these VWOs will have to tender for this project. But the guidelines are all given by the ministries. Because personally, I just sometimes feel pessimistic in that sense, what is the mindset of the bureaucracy, and how can it change back to a so-called more social orientation? If you were to say that, if there is this political castration in terms of leadership, then how can civil service come up with creative initiative? Because within the civil service, you don't have that ability to disagree or come up with creative ideas. Correct me if I'm wrong, I hope I'm wrong. You have been in the civil service in that sense. Are you able to challenge your bosses? Are you able to say, okay, let's not be market-oriented? So where do this philosophy or ideology come from, and how can you challenge it? Power does not concede, right?
Without demand.
Yes. Even with demand, it won't concede.
Any other comments?
I just want to strongly disagree with the idea that the PAP was socialist. I think the core executive was an extension of the colonial regime, which needed a group of elites to protect its interests from the larger majority who wanted it. I also think that it's now they did all this because they needed to undermine the opposition, the arguments of the opposition, and now that the opposition is gone and they have everything in control, they can just stop pretending to.
Okay, I guess it drift. Yeah. So I'll just answer those questions. I think after we have to. I've been told we have to end here. So please go for some chicha or something. So okay. I think to Corinne's point. Why is market fundamentalism or neoliberalism such a seductive doctrine? There are two reasons, right? One is, of course, that the whole world was taken by it. So if you went to Harvard MBA or you went to any of the business school or administration schools at the time that Lee Hsien Loong and all went, they would have all said, oh, just rely on the market, fine, everything will be fine, everything is most efficient. Even Alan Greenspan, until he had this moment of remorse or reverse epiphany, he himself truly believed. I think these people genuinely believed that the market would solve all ills. It was not as though they were ill intention. I think it was just an ideology, like a paradigm that captured the world's images, not just Singapore. Right? We just happened to go to those schools and saw everything hook, line, sinker. But the reason why it's so popular in the civil service is precisely the reason it got alluded to. Is that if you can farm something out to the market, you don't have to make a decision yourself. You don't have to take responsibility for the decision. The market decided for you. It's not your fault. Right? The market decided on the market, so you can't blame me. Right? So it is a good way of doing two things. One is covering your backside and not exposing yourself to blame. And it's also a good excuse not to think. Right? So it's an excuse to be A, lazy, and B, irresponsible without being caught, and in fact being promoted for it. So wouldn't you do that? Most of us would if we offered a chance to be promoted in being lazy and responsible when going to work. Right? So it's simple economics. That's the reason it's so popular. It's so easy to be like that, to be lazy in thought. You talk to Lim Siong Wan, who's one of the old-time firm sects. The old-time firm sects, I disagree partly. I think there were a lot of old-time firm sects and old-time ministers that were genuinely socialistic at heart. And if you go and you look at even their lifestyles and what they think, and you work with them and you look at their reactions, in terms of when they consider, even as Ngo, when you consider his reactions to the problem of the working poor versus some of the younger ministers' direction, right? There is a concern, there is an identification, there is there is, I see Kenneth nodding his head because he knows exactly what I'm talking about. There is an automatic concern with the working people, right? That someone who has been brought up in the socialist movement doesn't leave you, right, so easily. And these people had it. I mean, you look at Toh Chin Chai and the way the ironic thing is that if you go and look at Lee Kuan Yew's house today, where he lives in Oxley Road, you go inside, wow, it looks like inside of a 3-room HDB flat, or worse, right? It looks like one of the working poor, one of the working, or a bit better, but not much, right? And you go and look at Toh Chin Chai's inside his house just when he died, it's exactly the same. Why? Is it because they copied they read the same lifestyle books? No, it's because they had the same social values, right? And they identified with ordinary people, and they didn't think that, living in a luxurious house was the be and end of life, as most of the other people do, that subsequently came after them. And so it's not strange to me that originally our social policy was much more social, affordability in housing. Even Lee Kuan Yew yesterday making an announcement, I think our people should, it's going on and on, right? So, I think we lost our way, and can we find our way out of the wilderness again? Can the civil service reclaim that kind of public-spirited policy making that takes responsibility, that actually thinks hard about real solutions, innovative solutions to problems, as opposed to just go for the easy answer? I think they can. I think they have it in them. It requires a change of leadership and direction at the top.